My fellow citizens, I know you love this country as much as I do. There is a lot to love about South Africa. We all want South Africa and her people to succeed. And it is heartbreaking to see so many of our citizens suffering in these difficult times. We pay tribute to those who have lost their lives to the virus, and our deepest condolences go out to their friends and their families. But what makes this virus even more heartbreaking is the fact that much of the hardship we're going through is unnecessary. In our efforts to fight off the very real threat of the virus, we've replaced it with an even bigger threat of our own making. The real tragedy playing out here is no longer the coronavirus, but the lockdown itself, because this lockdown is going to cost many more lives than it can possibly save. This is a hard truth to speak, and it's an even harder truth to hear, but it is a truth that must be spoken. We have to end the lockdown crisis, and we have to end it now. There is very little for us to gain and almost everything to lose by keeping people at home and keeping businesses shut any longer. The only reason we entered into the lockdown was to buy some time. We weren't trying to stop all COVID infections. We weren't trying to kill the virus. We were simply giving our hospitals time to prepare, to give our healthcare workers the best possible chance of dealing with the inevitable wave of infections when it finally hit us. We knew then, as we know now, that this wave is still coming, lockdown or not. We also know that our country's economy could only withstand a very limited freeze. This is why the lockdown originally had an end date. 3 weeks is what it was going to take to source equipment, to get hospitals ready, and to train doctors and nurses in COVID protocols. However, before those 3 weeks were up, it was decided that a little more time was needed, and so those 3 weeks soon became 5. Those extra 2 weeks came at a huge cost to our country, but at least there was an end date, and we could brace ourselves for that duration. All of this had to be a very delicate trade-off. Shut everything down at enormous cost to the livelihoods of millions of our citizens for a short period, and hopefully save many lives in the process. But this is the thing about managing this pandemic. There is not only one trade-off. You're going to have to make them all the time. Every day the situation changes. The odds change, and you constantly have to be able to reassess this trade-off. 6 weeks ago, that decision by President Ramaphosa to act quickly in shutting the country down to delay the spread of the virus was the right thing to do. I was one of those who stood firmly behind the president and supported his early call for a nationwide lockdown. The whole country did. At the time, it was undoubtedly the right thing to do. But although at the time the president was called brave and bold, that would turn out to be one of the easiest decisions that the president would have to make in this crisis. We could all see what was happening around the world. We could do what they were doing, but we were able to do it faster and firmer. It was the right thing for the president to do, but not necessarily the bravest thing he will have to do, because the real bravery will be required later, when the time comes to open everything up again and face what we have been preparing for, the spike in infections. That was the whole point of the hard lockdown, to prepare South Africa for the opening up. I also supported the president when he announced that we would be moving into a phased approach to the lockdown, what he called a risk-adjusted model that would allow for a return to work, schools, and ultimately normal life. The DA had just proposed a very similar model to him, and we were very grateful that some of the work that we had done had found fertile soil. I said at the time that we would judge this model on the details, but in principle, it was a good move. But we were right to reserve our judgment. Level 4 of the lockdown, as it turns out, is hardly different from level 5. In fact, many respects, it is more restrictive and not less. We now have a military curfew enforced by more than 75,000 armed soldiers, which we didn't have under level 5. And even our shopping hours have been reduced instead of expanded. This wasn't progress towards a more open society and economy at all. It was simply an extension of the hard lockdown, but this time with no final deadline in sight. What the DA had proposed in our smart lockdown was a detailed plan, sector by sector, for how we could safely return to normality. What the government gave us was simply a longer set of rules and a curfew on top of it. As most of you have seen or even personally experienced, the rules and restrictions under the supposed lighter level of lockdown are often petty, irrational, and authoritarian. It's little wonder then that these rules are increasingly met with resistance and in some cases outright civil disobedience. If you want people on your side, you have to treat them with the respect that they deserve. You have to treat them like adults. Instead, we have seen our citizens treated like common criminals. We have seen people abused and humiliated in the streets and in their properties by members of the police and the army. And sadly, we've even seen citizens die at the hands of these armed forces. We have seen good Samaritans arrested for nothing more than the crime of feeding the poor and hungry in our nation. We have seen arbitrary rules on what may and may not be purchased, drawn up with the stroke of a pen. There's no rational argument for the continued ban on cigarettes, or alcohol for that matter. We've seen announcements from ministers on keeping sectors of the economy shut that have nothing to do with halting the spread of the virus. Petty, irrational announcements like the ban on all e-commerce. We have seen outrageous announcements from the Small Business and Development Minister and Tourism Minister where they intend to exclude some of our South African citizens on the arbitrary factor of race or other arbitrary criteria from the emergency relief measures. We have already written to the head of the IMF, where a large part of this relief funding will come from, to urge them to instruct government not to use this money in a way that discriminates against some South Africans. We have also instructed our lawyers to take this matter to the High Court because it is unconscionable that a government would play identity politics in a time of national crisis. And we are going to continue to fight and overturn any regulation that is irrational or moral, whether in court or through other means. And we will fulfill our duty as an official opposition of guarding against the abuse of power. Because never before in democratic South Africa has the power of the state been so concentrated in the hands of so few. And all the while, South Africans have been asked to give up even more for even longer without questioning any of it. That has to end. South Africans have now done more than their bit. They have been asked to sacrifice, and they have done so. Many of our citizens have lost all they had. They have sat diligently in their homes as our country's economy slowly crumbled around them, waiting for the news that the hospitals and the doctors were ready and we could resume our lives. I don't have to tell you how hard it has been and how hard this wait has been. Many of you know full well what it's like to go week after week without any income, or to wait for that dreaded phone call to say, "I'm sorry, you no longer have a job." Thousands of businesses have closed. Many more are about to. Each of these businesses was a precious lifeline for the employees and their families. National Treasury says that the best case scenario, we stand to lose 3 million jobs. And that's if we do everything right and end the lockdown now. The worst case scenario is 7 million jobs. And that's on top of the 10 million of our citizens who are already unemployed before COVID hit. SARS says that we will miss our revenue target by a massive 285 billion. That is a fifth of our income. It's meant to pay for teachers, nurses, police officers. It's meant to deliver water and housing. Now, we're not the United States or the UK, Germany or Japan. We don't have the means to navigate around this kind of loss. The effect on poor South Africans will be devastating. This is a self-inflicted catastrophe far, far greater than anything the virus could throw at us. Mr. President, by creating this lockdown crisis, you've broken your sacred compact with the people of South Africa. You've weaponized our trust and you have turned it against us. Instead of trusting citizens back, lives have been devastated and livelihoods have been destroyed through brutality and coercion. And you have turned the free citizens of our republic into the subjects of an authoritarian government. We're no longer dealing with a COVID-19 crisis. We are dealing with a lockdown crisis, an ANC lockdown crisis to be precise. Let me be very clear. There is no longer a justification to keep this hard lockdown in place. Government cannot even produce the justification. They cannot show us the modelling they use to decide when to ease and when to tighten restrictions. They cannot do this because they don't seem to know for sure themselves. And so every decision is now shrouded in secrecy. We're told to blindly trust a body called the National Command Council, a small group of cabinet ministers who don't answer to Parliament or anyone else. When asked for their meeting minutes to clarify why they backtracked on the cigarette ban, the National Command Council refused, claiming this was now classified information. I don't buy that for a second, and neither should you. The DA has filed a PIA application to obtain not only the minutes of their cigarette discussion, but of all their other decisions relating to the lockdown. It is crucial that we as citizens know exactly why, according to government, we are still in a destructive lockdown. What we do know is that government's very own epidemic expert, Professor Karim, thinks that this lockdown has already run its course and it is now of little more use. In fact, that was his view 2 weeks ago, yet here we still are. We know that the sole reason for locking the country down was to buy time to boost our healthcare response. We've done this. What hasn't happened in the past 6 weeks is not going to happen now. The only thing keeping us locked down now is fear. And we have every right to fear the virus. We have every right to worry about the health of our loved ones, and particularly those who are at higher risk. We have every right to feel unsure about the future and what our world will look like 3 months, 6 months, or a year from now. But this is not the reason to remain locked down. We cannot afford to remain trapped by fear alone. If there is a good reason for maintaining the lockdown based on a scientific modelling of this pandemic, then we as citizens need to know what this reason is. We need to see government's modelling. If no reason and no modelling can be shared, then we have no choice but to suspect that government is acting irrationally or deliberately instilling fear to further another agenda. Since the start of this crisis, the DA has called for all of this data to be shared publicly. We have made extensive and multiple submissions to the President explaining exactly what kind of data is needed for decisions to be made. This must go way beyond just the number of infections, deaths, and recoveries in the country and for each province. The data has to be localized. It has to include a detailed breakdown of age and gender, comorbidities, and most importantly, it has to include the full updated picture of the state of our healthcare preparation in every town and every city. It also has to include a very detailed picture of our screening, testing, tracing, and tracking efforts. Because if we don't know this, we have no way of knowing whether the lockdown serves any purpose at all. And we have no way of knowing if and when we will ever come out of it. We're about to enter our 7th week of lockdown, which means that we're fast catching up with the longest lockdowns in the world. Wuhan at 8 and Italy at 9 weeks. Every single day that we stay here comes at a massive cost because every day more businesses are closed down and more families are left destitute. But there is some good news too, and we can see this virus spread through the world and we get a clearer picture of its effect. One encouraging part of the picture is that the mortality rates are not as high as initially thought. While still very dangerous, the coronavirus is not as deadly as we had feared. Most people who contract it will get better, or perhaps not even know they had it. For younger, healthier people, the risks are not much higher than a normal seasonal flu. This means we have based our response on overestimated risks. Our strategy has been flawed, and we need to respond to this new information by phasing out of this hard lockdown. And this is where the DA's smart lockdown model comes in, a real phased approach that balances the flattening of the infection curve with the safe opening up of our economy. Under this approach, the 3 steps that we must all do, wearing masks, washing hands, and maintaining physical distance, are still critical. We then use extensive testing to identify where the virus is spreading out of control so that we can use localized lockdowns to contain that spread. At the same time, we protect the elderly and others who are at risk through isolation. And then the rest of us get back to work. where every business and every sector will have comprehensive safety regulations in place, which they will have to comply with. Every single business that can safely open must be allowed to open immediately. This is how we can effectively stop the spread of infections and spread them out so that our hospitals can cope, while still allowing businesses to operate safely and allow people to earn a living. We need to do this right away, because every day we now delay comes at a price our country and our citizens can no longer afford. We need to end the lockdown in an orderly way before the people of the country end it with chaos. Millions of people are already breaking the law, not because they are criminals, but because they are hungry. Not because they want to, but because they have to. Not because they are bad, but because the laws are themselves bad. When a rule is met by mass non-compliance, it's a very good indication that the rule is irrational. If you need an example of this, just look at what happened with e-tolls. There is no bravery or compassion to be found in extending this lockdown. The true bravery and compassion is in the mothers and fathers, the grandmothers and grandfathers who risk arrest or death to break the lockdown so that they can feed and clothe their families. The true bravery and compassion, Mr. President, will be in ending this hard lockdown. And you need to be warned, Mr. President. If you do not come to your senses and rein these ministers in and end this lockdown crisis, millions more are going to start breaking the law in the coming days and weeks. If you don't end it, the people of South Africa are going to take charge and they are going to end it for you. As it now stands, the lockdown is a tragic mistake that has already caused damage that risks dooming an entire generation of South Africans to a lifetime of destitution and suffering. Now, we can't undo any of this. We can't turn back the clock. But what we can do is act now to end this lockdown crisis and get as many of our citizens back to work as safely as possible. This is the only way that we will ensure that once we have defeated the virus, we will have a country left to rebuild. Thank you very much. Stay safe, South Africa. We have a beautiful country and it's worth fighting for.